My notifications off here.
Good evening, everyone. I am live here with Grizzly Patriot, Mark Friesen. So, Mark Friesen is a fellow Saskatchewan member. I guess you'd call him a Saskabusher, as I like to say. And he is hanging out here a couple hours away from me. We're both hunkering down. It's about minus, I don't know, 35-ish here. So it's very, very cold in Saskatchewan. So we thought we'd do a good live stream, talk about some of the major issues going on nationally, sovereignty, that kind of thing. So I will pass this on over to Mark. I will let him introduce himself. I don't think he's all that grizzly, but I wouldn't mess with him even if I were you. So put it that way. Go ahead, introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself, Mark.
Yeah, so good day, good evening. It's nice to be. Thanks, Kelly, for having me on. It made it guaranteed that I would be in my basement tonight, hunkered down, because I don't want to go outside. It's too cold. So it's nice. Thanks for having me on. This is awesome. Mark Friesen, that's my name. On Twitter, it's the Grizzly Patriot, and some in the Yellow Vest movement know me as the Grizzly Patriot, which is interesting because a couple of things I've never done. One is I've never been really an activist, not in the sense of the Yellow Vest activism, and I've never considered myself, at least openly or proudly, as a patriot. I've never referred to myself as a patriot. So both of these things sort of combined, and ultimately I was inspired to get involved with the Yellow Vest end of things, and even politically, because I was inspired by what I saw our government, particularly Potato, and I never referred to our prime minister as by his name. It's always by his nickname that China gave him. So, so he sort of inspired me based on his actions. But that inspiration was always sort of just beneath the surface, because for a lot of years I've been sort of studying geopolitics and how these decisions and these policies that we keep getting rammed down our throat in Canada are coming at us from. So I spent a lot of time researching the UN and how they arrive at policy and what they're made up of, and so in that I also spent a lot of time, probably the last 10 years or so, researching Islam and its effect on the West, and so it's because they're all connected. At the end of the day, all of these issues, especially in Canada, we see it on the ground, we see it in our face. All of these issues are connected. I didn't understand it at the time, but the more I researched and the more I studied, the more I came to the realization that all of these issues that piss all of us off are all connected, and they all end up at the same place, which is the UN. So anyways, so that's how I got to where I am today, as far as being an activist and calling myself a patriot, and actually being proud to call myself a nationalist. And I know that's like, to some, ooh, that's, you're a nationalist. Well, there is fundamentally nothing wrong with being a nationalist. It just means that you advocate for the sovereignty of your country and you love your country. That's it. There's no color in front of nationalist or race or any of that. Take all of that out of it. I'm a nationalist, and I'm proud to be a Canadian, and I want to keep my country and its culture and values, which of course is freedom, liberty, respect, equality, hard work, and all of those things that make us Canadian. And everyone says, well, we don't have an identity. Well, sure, we have an identity. We have a clear identity. We stand out in the world above every other country because of who we are, and what makes us Canadian is what we are, right? And so anyways, that was the long answer to who I am.
Well, long answers are kind of the best way for discussions, I think. So not a problem. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being on the show here, Mark. Channel, I guess it's not really a show. I see quite a few people having a chat here. Yeah, please guys do. I've heard how red-pilled is the channel. Good question. I don't censor. I don't ever kick someone out of a chat, just so you guys know, unless you're causing nothing but problems and ruining it for everybody else. It's pretty much open, but I'm not one, and I don't think Mark is either. we're both trying to fight to keep this clean. And like he said, we're into nationalism, not like white nationalism, not ethnic nationalism. I'm not particularly fond of discussing what you might call the Jewish question. So if that helps you understand in the chat, any thoughts on that, Mark? Where would you like to head with your intentions for this chat? Because I know that it does invite lots of different ideas, and I know it's very controversial.
And this is, it's fantastic, actually, because whenever there's, and I see it in the Yellow Vest groups on Facebook, of course, and I see it with political stuff. As soon as you broach the topic like nationalism, let's say, well, out from the woodwork comes, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat any of this. So anybody watching, if you're offended easily, too bad. Because as soon as you mention these hot button topics, and they're only hot button topics because the media and politicians have made them hot button topics like nationalism. But as soon as you bring it up, and because of the environment that we're in these days in the political realm and the media realm, as soon as you bring them up, well, you get people from the far left or the far right, and the far left is going to call me a racist because I'm a nationalist. I mean, just today I was watching Max Bernier's rally, and somebody came on, and because Max said we're nationalist, well, all of a sudden we're extremists. Well, the two words aren't connected in any way in the English language, and neither are they in actuality. So being nationalist isn't extremist. However, so when you have these discussions, then you have the radicals on the right that jump in and all immediately make it about race and put a color in front of nationalism. And so we have to be able to still have the discussion, but handle it in the same way that I just saw you handle it, Kelly, and say, listen, there's nuance to this discussion. Just because I'm nationalist doesn't make me a white nationalist. Just because I'm white and a nationalist doesn't make me a nationalist or a racist. But then you have to have that same conversation with the left, right? With the other side of the argument, and say exactly the same thing. Just because I'm a nationalist doesn't make me a white nationalist, even though the color of my skin is white. I'm still just a nationalist, and I'm fighting for Canadian freedom and sovereignty for my kids, for my neighbors, for my friends, my co-workers, who happen to be of all different races and ethnicity and come from all over the world and immigrate to Canada. Why do they immigrate to Canada? Because Canada is a culture of freedom and liberty and equality, right? So that's, but we have to maintain our sovereignty and our freedom and our culture in order to keep being a country that people want to come to. And so if we don't do that, then we will lose what the attraction is in the first place. So yeah, I mean, so that argument and these hot button discussions always bring out, every radical on the left and the right and everyone in between. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have the talk. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be discussing them. I'll give you another example. I went to a meeting a while back, and it was the first time we all met. And I put to the folks in the meeting, and it was a political meeting. And I put to the folks that we should, as it relates to Facebook and social media and how we're going to handle ourselves, we should really identify for ourselves as moderating these groups. We should identify exactly what racism is. I couldn't even get into the discussion before I was shot down by people in the meeting that said, well, what do we need to talk about that for? We shouldn't even mention it. And I was shocked, because here I am with a bunch of people. I'm thinking I'm generally of like mind. Mm-hmm. And my point was that we need to identify what racism is, because one person might think because I am critical of Islam, that automatically makes me racist. So that's in their perspective, but in my perspective, that's not racist. In fact, it has nothing to do with race, because Islam is a religion, not a race. And I should be able to criticize a set of bad ideas. So then on the other side, then there's people that say, and supported me and say, yeah, we should have this, but the conversation was shut down. Now, it wasn't in that place. It wasn't necessary to have that discussion at that time. Let it go. But that's just an example of how sensitive people are now, whether it's online or in the real world, that we can't even have the discussion because somebody's going to be offended by it. And we need to get to a place where we can have these discussions. They have to happen. So I hope that answers that question. I told you I'd be rambling, Kelly. Yeah.
No, rambling, like I said, rambling's my specialty. It makes my life easier if you can keep the conversation going. And well, I have a YouTube channel. I tend to ramble a little myself. So no, that answers the question perfectly. I think ultimately both of us are kind of hoping for moderation. Now, not moderation in the sense of tepid values or lukewarm values, but rather moderation in the sense of not trying to cause more division, more polarization, more anger, more knee-jerk reactions. I can't remember who I heard it from recently. They said it's not about race or color. Ironically, you know, warring tribes years and years ago, any part of the planet, doesn't matter. People would war against, you know, neighboring tribes, and often they were of the same color. They lived in the same demographic. It was about values. It was about people getting along based on similar values. And what you said about certain conditions or certain concerns, of course, Islam comes up as one of the primary issues with immigration, because we do happen to be importing a great deal of people from that ideology to the Western world. And of course, there are major concerns for whether or not Western values and, you know, the Magna Carta and the rule of law here are really, you know, actually able to kind of comply with and work alongside with these types of ideas. So it's unfortunate we can't talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, everybody just gets mad. And the less we're allowed to talk about it, and I said this in one of my videos recently, like M103, for example, discourages talking about these things, but then people get more and more frustrated and pent up, and you wonder why people are lashing out online. I mean, some people are going to lash out because that's how they are, but ultimately people feel censored, and even the nicest person, you can push them so far. The fact that I'm doing YouTube videos is a huge testament. And I know for yourself, you're saying, you know, you just became patriotic. I know what you mean. I never thought about this stuff before. And then all of a sudden you realize, like, holy shit, we're actually in trouble. And then we get called conspiracy theorists, right? So that's the fun part too, of, I guess, on the left, with conspiracy theorists. So diving right into that, then it's a good way to open into the first topic, which is really kind of the whole topic, but we'll dive into some separate issues. I met Mark as Grizzly Patriot on Twitter, and then I met him in Saskatchewan at a Yellow Vest rally. And he had done a speech that first day and spoke about Agenda 2030 and the UN and how many ways that actually affects our country and other places in the world. I had no idea, and I'm hoping that he will dive into some of what he said. He's welcome to ramble as long as he'd like, and I'll take a look for questions, but if you guys can keep your questions closer to the end, or put it up in a highlight, however you can do that, I don't know how, and I'll try to keep track of it as we go. So please do explain what you know about Agenda 2030.
Well, so I guess I have to put out a disclaimer first. I am no stretch any accredited expert in anything I say. Actually, this is basically unfortunately, we're in a position right now where we have to do a lot of our research. We don't get our information from the media, I'll tell you that much, especially as it relates to the UN Sustainable Development Agenda. There is literally almost nothing on, or has ever been anything on your mainstream media whatsoever, which is why when you broach the topic of the UN and Sustainable Development Agenda and 2030 and Agenda 21, people look at you like you are a conspiracy theorist. And to be honest, when I first dove into this topic, I guess the reason why I'll say first is because I was trying to reconcile everything that was happening in Canada policy-wise to what I've been told and what the media has told me and why schooling has told me and my educators and just society in general, that the UN is this fantastic thing that was started after the World War II, and it was to maintain peace and prosperity around the globe. So, you know, unicorns and pixie dust, and all was good with the UN. But then you still can't reconcile what you see in what's happening. And so you start to research, because again, the media is not telling you anything. So I really started to get into researching it. Unfortunately, at that time, years ago, within the last 10 years, but a number of years ago, you would go to YouTube and you would see, and in my opinion at the time was, holy, these guys are crazy. This is some really crazy shit they're talking about. And so I'd back away. But then I would try to somewhere else, a different source. And then you try to find and you understand what sources are credible, what sources are not credible. And when you go through that maze of information, you will at some point get to where you need to go, so you actually can learn some factual information. And so that's what I've been doing for a number of years. And so by doing that, I changed from what I thought or perceived it as conspiracy theory to reality. And in actual fact, these are the things that are happening, and it's actually happening. And again, still at that time, this is, you know, as we progress through the learning and the studying, you understand that the information, you actually have to search for it on the UN website or go to UN Watch and really sit down and study what's going on. The conspiracy theorists are still there, but there was nothing at that time on social media, YouTube or other places that you could go to get actual, you know, credible information. So it was tough, and the UN wasn't promoting it, and the media wasn't promoting any of this, because I mean, the Sustainable Development Agenda was basically started in the late 60s by a group of people. The Club of Rome was one group, and there was a few writers that wrote some articles in some major newspapers in the States regarding sustainable development and population replacement. So that was kind of the impetus for this whole thing that we're experiencing now. So that's late 60s, and Rockefeller was part of that in developing this plan, and big banks and big money and what have you. So it from that point, it developed to where in 1972 they came up with the first sustainable development articles in the UN, and really starting to develop the framework for this agenda. And it was, I mean, it's a huge agenda, and it's morphed into this huge thing. But our governments in Canada have been right along beside this agenda building and developing right from 1972. The first Trudeau signed on to the first paper, and then of course the first agreement, and it's moved and morphed into what it is now. So it's something that we've been blind to in society. I mean, of course we're blind to it. Who wants to study any of this stuff when we don't see, you know, we're just in the 80s, we were all pretty cool with things when I was growing up. And I mean, we all did what we did, and nobody paid attention to anything that happened, you know, at the UN or, you know, outside of town, really. I mean, we didn't have the internet, right? We didn't have this globe opening up to us, so we didn't care. And so the UN and the agenda just kept rolling along, and none of us paid any attention to it. So, but they've morphed it to the point now where we can actually see in real time what's happening and how it affects us. So this Sustainable Development Agenda, right up 2015 was the last major one that was signed, transforming our world. And it was the Conservatives who signed that September of 2015, which essentially opened the door for the Paris Accord, or kept the door open, I should say, is a better way to put it. Kept the door open for the Paris Accord. Climate change is a huge element to the Sustainable Development Agenda, and open the door to carbon tax now that we're seeing, and we can feel it, and we're seeing it firsthand. So people are starting to have to look and pay attention. And then, of course, migrant pact is another one that came from it. And again, we're impacted. We're seeing the migrant crisis, not to the level in Europe here yet, but we're seeing it in Quebec, right on the border. They're flowing in, and so we understand it. It's in our face. We have no choice as Canadians to actually stop and look and see what's happening. But so they developed this sustainable agenda to the point now where, I mean, it's already in place throughout the world, throughout Canada, right down to our city here in Saskatoon, and in the form of bike lanes. I always use bike lanes as an example. Sometimes,
I remember you saying that, like there's so many things that we see in municipal planning that are from this sustainable agenda.
Yeah, and that's you know, and it's funny because I mentioned earlier how you see things and then you go look and, oh, look, that's attached to the UN, and then you see something else, oh, that's attached to the UN. And so for an example, I'll use another example other than bike lanes, because I mean, bike lanes works, and it's a fact, and it is part of the UN agenda under the new urban agenda. So that's another part to this. But there's another one that's specifically of interest to me because I own a tree service in Saskatoon. So one of the agenda items from Agenda 21 is, and that's the Agenda 21 is more geared for urban and new urban development and for urban policy and these types of things. So when you look at trees, for example, Vancouver, some of the bigger centers already have these policies in place where you as a homeowner, you think you own the property that you bought your house on. And with that, of course, you assume that you own the trees that are on that property. So in some centers, bigger centers that have already implemented this policy, you're not allowed to cut down or prune a tree on your own property. You need to get a permit, and it needs to be to go through the government, and you have to pay a fee, and there's all this red tape and bureaucracy because the city wants to have control of the urban forest, including what's on your property. So they need to get, so some centers like Vancouver and Toronto, they actually have to get a permit from the city to be allowed to do any tree maintenance on your property. That hasn't come to Saskatoon, but at some point it's going to, because it is, they've already talked about, council's already talked about it. So when I saw this, the council's going to talk about this policy, I had to take a really good look at it. And of course I went straight to the UN, and there it is in black and white, new urban agenda, urban forest. Yep. Cities shall have authority over all trees, including private citizens' trees, right? So that's just one example of how their tentacles have reached right down to municipal levels and even small town levels, and are forcing municipalities to follow the agenda and to follow what's happening. So it's such a huge thing, and it's been in place for such a long time, and we've been blind to it, that now all of a sudden we're all shocked and we're all upset at all of these issues. It's just scratching the surface of how many policies are going to be coming at us that were developed at the UN. So my issue from a big picture perspective is this: we are having to accept policies, I mean, yeah, directly from our government, but our government has signed on to this agenda. So it's not from our government. It's coming from an unelected body that sits together in a hall, and they develop policies that are good in their eyes and in their words, good for the planet. Well, those policies aren't specific to Canada and Canada's best interest and what's best for Canadians. It has nothing to do with what's best for people that live in Saskatoon, who now don't have proper roads to travel on because they're taken up by bike lanes because 12 people ride a bicycle in Saskatoon, right?
Yeah, this isn't Vancouver. I don't think people realize that we don't have quite as many cyclists as they do in some of the urban cities in this country. So
right, in urban cities that don't have minus 30 degrees out during the winter. So biking is, but so anyways, so my issue is then, why are we accepting policy that's being developed by these unelected bureaucrats, this megalith of bureaucrats, this huge body of bureaucrats that with their ultimate plan is redistribution of wealth. So taking money from the West, because that's where most of the wealth is, we're going to take your money, we're going to divide it equally amongst the rest of the poorer countries, and all that does is make us equally as poor as every other country. So that's ultimately their game plan here, and to have central control at the UN. Now, they develop these plans and they come up with these ideas. They say that each country, the UN and its body is a democracy, one country, one vote. Well, okay, but that's not really true, because with every group of people, with every group of countries, whatever group you have, you always seem to divide into groups, and there's always a power, there's always a hierarchy, and there's a power base within any group that you're part of. It doesn't matter if it's right down to a hockey program or whatever. There's always a natural hierarchy. Well, the same goes for the UN. So there's 193 countries that make up the UN. 120 of those countries are the non-aligned membership. So those are countries that have aligned themselves. They call themselves non-aligned, but they're actually in being non-aligned to anyone else, they're aligned with each other. So there's 120 of these countries. Not one of those countries is Western civilized country. Not one. And so within that 120, you also have the 56 plus 1 Organization of Islamic Cooperation bloc or group, and of which, again, none are Western civilized countries. And so out of these 120 altogether, not one of them have any interest in promoting or assisting or securing, maintaining, developing our sovereignty in Canada, or helping with our issues in Canada, or helping with our homeless in Canada, or helping our natives who don't have running water up north at reserves. I mean, they'll say it. They'll say that, oh, Canada, you've treated your Indigenous so terribly for so many years, you have to pay this amount of money, right? But there's no real plan. There's no help for the West. The West is only there because we're footing the bill for the most part. Right. So you have these countries that are developing policy for the plan of redistribution of wealth and population replacement, and we're left to just accept what's happening. And we have governments now like Trudeau that just is one. I mean, we're talking about a prime minister. Oh, I said his name, by the way.
Oh no, it's like Voldemort. You're not supposed to give that any power.
My tongue's on fire now.
Oh no.
But we give him, or he gives us the statement before the election that Canada will be the first post-nation state. Yay, right? And somehow he makes that statement. It's it's everywhere, but not everyone, 39% of Canadians still vote for him. It's amazing to me. It drives me insane that we have a prime minister before he's elected can say, we're heading for as a post-nation state. We're going to be the first post-nation state. It's amazing. And so we've seen it. He's consistent. We've seen that once he got elected, that's exactly what he's doing. He is creating a post-nation state out of Canada. He is and has sold our sovereignty to the UN. There's no question in my mind. We see it. We know it out of his own mouth. So the rest of the Canadians that love their country and want to protect their sovereignty really somehow need to wake up. So I guess ultimately that's why I'm doing what I'm doing in my little part to help wake up the rest of the country.
Yes, fair enough. Same as what I'm doing, except of course I come from maybe a slightly different background. I don't know your political background, but for anyone who's not familiar with my channel, I am indeed an ex-lefty, so I'm paying penance. I was going through a lot of life stuff, which is why I was more of a lefty kind of, you're dealing with life crises, you can't always look outward, but as soon as you find out what's going on, for anyone who doesn't know what's going on, it's one thing to be naive, but when you realize what Trudeau is doing to this country, anyone that at this point can in good conscience vote for this guy. Now, I'm curious from your perspective, two things. Number one, do you feel, because this is always an argument, we hear varying things. Is Trudeau, an evil kind of, not genius, no one's going to say he's a genius, that's outlandish, but is he, is Socks a genius in the sense of, is he evil? Is he narcissistic? Does he have a plan? Or is he just sort of the very dumb puppet that is being used by someone else? Because I tend to think he's extremely lacking empathy. I know he's a narcissist because I've dealt with narcissists, but as far as his overall plan, I think he wants power and seats in the UN. But I mean, what are your thoughts on his motives? Is he just in a sense a puppet?
I remember a number of years ago when he was a snowboard instructor, and somebody floated out the idea in the media that Justin Trudeau will be the next prime minister. And this was before he was even in politics. And I thought to myself, you know what? They're right. He will be. And the only reason I thought that was because, first of all, his name. And second of all, literally what he looks like and where he comes from. And I thought, you know what? I bet you they're right. I bet you he will be prime minister one day. And then you watch the progression of him, gets into the party, he's put in a position, he's groomed, and next thing you know, of course, he's the party leader, and lo and behold, here he is, our prime minister. I think he's probably, I mean, on one hand, I'm not shocked, but on the other hand, of course, I'm in shock every day. I think he is too, to be honest. I think he feels the same way. I think he sort of thought, yeah, I'm entitled to that job. But then when he actually has a job, I think he's a figurehead. He's put in place to promote the agenda. His dad was a huge, enormous globalist, and he was part of the sustainable development in its infancy. And so to see Trudeau follow in daddy's footsteps, oh, I called him Trudeau again, but to see him follow in his daddy's footsteps, it doesn't surprise me in the least. He's in way over his head, but which is exactly what they want. I mean, the Liberal Party wanted somebody that they could just keep promoting, and he bought into the role, and he's doing a wonderful job from that perspective, because he's doing exactly what he's told.
And he's a, you know, sadly, he's a good pick on their front for the sheeple, right? Like, he's someone that supposedly seems to be what all the young people seem to want nowadays. He's a feminist, and he's so woke, and everything else is apparently, you know, the image that they're going for. And sadly, that does seem to work. I mean, that's what I find amazing, is that not all liberals and left-leaning people are, you know, a lot of conservatives I've noticed since I've, you know, walked away have commented a lot on that, you know, because Joe Hayes is another walk away. There's a few of us, right? And they've said, you know, those people are stupid and this and that. And granted, there's some people that can't, you know, like when we talk about this stuff with the UN, there's going to be people that just, you cannot wake up. They are just not rational thinkers. It's just impossible. But a lot of times people are just naive, or they're extremely smart, but they're afraid to really deal with this stuff because they don't want to dive in. Like, I didn't want to talk about Islam, you know, 5-6 years ago. I was afraid to get into it. And now, you know, people say, ironically though, do your research and some of these things. Okay, fine, I'll do my research. You don't end up feeling better about this stuff. You end up feeling worse. If I start reading more about Islam and Islamism, I'm far more afraid than I was when I was ignorant of it, right? And it's the same with the UN. So growing up, I heard a lot about Trudeau Senior, Sock Senior, although I don't think he had a sock thing. I wasn't alive then. But I know that my parents have complained and complained. And you hear growing up all the farmers complaining about Trudeau Senior and why having his son in was such a bad thing. I never understood, though, that goes far beyond issues of Western sovereignty, which of course are a whole other ballgame, and now deep into our own nation, like you said, a post-national state. That's what he's defined us as. What do you think it will take to try to help wake up other Canadians to how big a deal this is? Of course, we have the media pushing how this is non-binding. The Compact for Migration is non-binding. None of this matters. It's hyperbolic. What are your thoughts? Because I've seen you take on some challenging opposers, and I'm curious on your view on this.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I'll relate your question to my experience of late with Yellow Vests and sort of how we're going to progress and actually get to the point where we can make some change and affect some change. So the Yellow Vest movement now has 160 to 180,000 members, give or take, on Facebook. It's really hard to nail down a number, but in there somewhere. There's so many groups now. So the way I look at it is the Yellow Vest movement is 6 weeks old now, and it's very young as a movement, as a protest. But it managed to attract a lot of people really quick, which was great, fantastic. And we all sort of were attracted at the same time over a carbon tax and migrant pact. Those were the two. Of course, you can also bring in the pipeline issue and the attack on the energy industry under the carbon tax and Paris Accord thing. So there was enough there to create a boiling point where, boom, 60,000 people join a movement in 6 weeks. That's phenomenal. And it really is phenomenal, especially for Canada. But I found, being in and working every day, sun up to sundown, with Yellow Vest and the movement, and trying to steer it in the right direction, I've come to realize that this 160,000 people are pretty much make up every Canadian who's woke, right? Who understands, who doesn't get their information from the media. They get it from other sources, from great sources like shows like yourself, Kelly, and long form discussions. Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Majid Nawaz, you know, all of these names, Rubin, Rogan. It's fantastic. It's opening people's eyes. It's opening people's getting people to think critically instead of just being told what to think, go through the motions. But so unfortunately, this movement that we're in, and at the time that we're in right now, it's 160,000 members, which is, again, it's fantastic. But that is a drop in the bucket to what we need if we actually want to affect change, if we want our politicians to pay attention to the reality of what's happening. And the only way we can do that is by educating the rest of the Canadians who are asleep, and wake them up and throw cold water on people and say, this is what is happening. And you can't do it. You can't do that. And this is what we've had these debates within the Yellow Vest movement, and there's still splits in the Yellow Vest movement because of it. But people are not going to join a movement based on solutions people have come up with for the problems, because people in the mainstream that aren't the 160,000 aren't woke enough. They don't understand the issues enough to even understand what the solution could be. So what I'm trying to do through the movement is to get it in a place where we're not only moving forward as a movement now, but we're attracting more people every day, all the time, based on the two issues that started the protest in the first place. And so once we can get, more people educated and more media attention and keep these rallies going and get to where we get to the convoy next month to Ottawa, and we can touch on that in a little bit too. And then really get some media coverage and really start waking people up and get more people. And it's like a snowball, right? And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, where we need to get to a point of critical mass. Once we get to that critical mass, and I'm not talking, 200, 400, 600,000 Canadians. I'm talking millions of Canadians awoke and understanding. Yes, I know. And we know you're pissed off about the migrant crisis or the migrant pact. You're pissed off about the carbon tax. You're pissed off because you don't have a job in the oil industry anymore because the pipelines won't be built and there's an attack on the end. We get it. I understand, but please listen to why those things are happening. Right. And let's take the conversation to the next level and look at where it's coming from, because again, there's going to be more issues tacked on to these two. And if we only micro protest pipelines, or we micro protest the migrant pact, we're going to be protesting till I'm long gone, and my kids will still be protesting, because we're not understanding the big picture. So if we can get to the point where, yes, okay, so we understand that there's these two issues, but they come from the Sustainable Development Agenda, from the UN, then we can start and continue to educate and get that critical mass. Then we can start solving the issue. Then we can force our government to say, no, we're going to start telling you what we want you to do, instead of you getting elected by using pandering and special interest groups and funding to get elected. So if you get elected, we're going to tell you now. We're in a position. We're millions of Canadians strong, and we understand why these things are happening. And we're going to start telling you what you're going to do. And we're going to start by saying, pull out of the Sustainable Development Agenda, pull out of globalism, essentially, and let's look after our interests in Canada first. Let's look after. We got veterans sleeping on the street every night across Canada. We have, as I mentioned before, we have native reserves that don't have running water in 2019.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, but yet we got to send billions in foreign aid to Africa or wherever in the Middle East. We have to send billions every year. Now think about this. Okay, so we've sent, for at least 40 years, we've sent billions of dollars to the UN for them to distribute to these countries so we can help them for 40 years. I don't know what the total billions of dollars is at, but I'm betting it's probably getting close to in the trillions if it isn't. Mm-hmm. What has it accomplished? It has accomplished absolutely nothing but more wars, more strife, more countries needing help and not developing. And what's happening there? So all of a sudden there's a migrant crisis, right? Now there's nowhere for these people to live, because it's not safe, because of whatever reason, because of you name it, that our 40 years, $1 billion should have looked after and hasn't done a thing. So now we're going to accept all of these migrants as a human right. Now we have to just allow them wherever throughout the West. Again, they're not migrating to Syria. They're not migrating to Chad in Africa. They're migrating from to the West. While we're going to lose our sovereignty, and we already have, and we are losing our sovereignty. And so they migrate here. Well, what happens when they get here? In mass migration. And and you have to separate that from immigration. Just mass migration. We're not screening anybody. We're not making sure that they're coming and they're going to be a benefit to Canada and help us economically and help fill jobs. No, they're coming here and we're going to look after them. So we've sent all our money there. It's done nothing. Now the migrant crisis is coming to Canada. We have to look after them while they're here. And it's en masse. And they're coming with And it's not going to do them any favors either, because they're coming from a country, a shithole, and I'll call it a shithole because that's what they are. They come from there with their culture to Canada. And what are they going to do when they get here? Well, they're all going to live together because that's what they know. That's what they feel comfortable. That's their tribe, right? That's,
yes, of course. The ghettoization, I guess you would call it, right, of Canada.
So, right. So then they end up in ghettos. And then there's no integration. There's no assimilation. There's no learning our culture. No, it's just going to continue as if they were coming still in their shithole country. Now, is that their fault? And this is where we have to look at both sides, because of course it's not their fault. If you were living in that situation and you were given an opportunity to live in a free and democratic country with respect and all of these other benefits that you also get from the government, are you going to say no? Of course you're going to go and take advantage of it. Why wouldn't you? Be stupid not to, especially if you got little kids, you got a family, you got a big family, you want to give them the best opportunity. Well, you're going to, of course, take advantage of that. So it's not their fault. So we have to also get away from us focusing our frustration and anger on these poor folks that are in a position that they didn't want to be in, that they didn't choose necessarily. And so we can't be, we have to direct our frustration to our government and their association with the UN and a whole other unelected body choosing policy and telling us and dictating to us what we're supposed to do. So I think that answers your question.
I think so. I'm just going to kind of comment. It's really interesting. Sorry, I got audio feedback. Hold on here. There we go. Hopefully this is better. But it's interesting that we, like I said, we're all told as Canadians this isn't a big deal. This isn't binding. The UN doesn't really have any power over us. And like you said, you end up taking so much responsibility away, and Canadians don't even know. Canadians just don't even realize that half of this is happening. And then when they do, there's such a push against the narrative, right? Because like you said, mainstream media is pushing a certain narrative. And there's something about Canadians, because we've always been the nice people, we've always been the kind people. We seem to want to hang on to that so desperately. And as someone who feels like my empathy was used and abused for years as a leftist, essentially, I feel like empathy is always the weapon. That's always what they use, right? You have to care. You have to care about the poor. You have to care about the people coming in. And why aren't you sharing? And you're immigrants too. That's always I'm sure you've heard that one. Well, we're all immigrants. Well, yes, we are. But when our ancestors came, we didn't come here into a social service situation. We didn't have free everything. Nobody put us up in hotels. They were building homesteads in -40 weather. They were, raising livestock and trading and everything else. So it's just the arguments that people are putting up right now, I find fascinating. And what really interests me is that people are more willing to push all this away, be in denial, just to save face and not be called a racist. They would rather not be called a racist, pardon me, than actually protect essentially our country. And what I've often argued when it comes to being worried about Islam, for example, because that is one of the major threats with migration right now that people are concerned about. And of course, you get called an Islamophobe and a racist, which actually makes no factual sense. But of course, there's a concern with it because, like you said, when people come here, they will essentially be collective group, and then you have suddenly laws are shifting, suddenly you have culture shifts. I don't know what the percentage is that you have to have of, like, say, majority Muslim countries. I don't remember what the percentage is where things start to change, but say Canada wide we're at about 3%, but Ontario is at 8 or something. So it does start to make you think, like, in 10 years is this going to be this insidious change that all these people don't think is a big deal? Oh, you're a racist. Oh, you're hyperbolic. Oh, it's a conspiracy theory. And then what? 5 years, 10 years from now, that's what scares me. Is I feel like Canadians are not just apathetic, they're so terrified of being looked at as a bad person that they refuse to look at the big picture. Like you said, that this money going out won't actually help anyone, that it's actually, if anything, causing more problems, that essentially turning the entire world into a big socialist experiment has nothing but negative things for the marginalized, as people are always looking out for. I mean, it's a narrative that's so strong. And I have to be honest, some days it's a bit disheartening to try to get into this stuff with people.
Well, it is, and it's it can be very depressing and very taxing. I mean, I just within family. I mean, I speak to my folks, and for years, I mean, they're old. My dad just passed away, and mom's still around, but they're old, and they listen to the CBC News since I was a kid. And it's just, that's how it is. We watch the news, we get our information from the CBC, and we're informed. And so that's, you know, in that generation, for me to start to wake up my mom would be fruitless. I would be wasting a whole lot of good time, because it's never going to happen. Because in reality, and you know, I think this is the case maybe with a lot of older folks, they don't want to necessarily know everything that's going on. I think they're happy in their world that they've created, and that's where they want to stay. And if they look outside the box, I mean, people would rather be naive and happy than awoke and depressed and upset. I mean, you know, I mean, even people are like my wife, she doesn't want to know what's going on in the big picture, because it's too depressing. There's too much to take in and to understand. And so, but I feel, and my personality and the way you know, my experience have led me to this point where, you know, I do understand what's going on, and it does concern me. So it does motivate me, and it energizes me to try to get the word out and to educate as many people that are willing to be educated and understand and learn. And so I'm hoping we can get to the point, because we always say, yeah, Canadians are apathetic and Canadians are nice and we're polite, but Canadians also are known for playing hockey. And so
you're speaking Saskatchewan language there. Yeah, people that play hockey have they've got a bit of a feist in them.
You know, we have a heart. We have a real big heart in Canada collectively. I think we have a huge heart, and most of that heart is, you know, sent out on the world as nice and polite, and it's all great. But we also have an intrinsic heart that when we're pushed to a certain level, the fight is on. And so I'm hoping that we can get the masses to understand the predicament that we're in right now, and the time frame that we're in right now, and understand that, yeah, we all love our country, and I think it's the best country on the planet, but we need to protect it. And right now, our politicians and our lawmakers are not doing that. They're doing the opposite. And so that's why, you know, it's funny, because people ask me both things that I'm heavily involved with right now, which is politics and Yellow Vest. Well, I started in politics. I've never been a politician, never thought I'd be a politician, although some people would argue that I should have been a politician a long time ago. But so when the People's Party and Max broke away from the Conservative Party, and I was convinced, well, first I was forced to do some research on my own, which I did. And I convinced myself ultimately, with the help of some friends that helped me, you know, at least talk about it, get that discussion going, and they did. And then I went and researched, and I actually came up with a short video that Max was in, where he was interviewed by Mark Stein, and they got onto the discussion of the UN almost immediately. It was about the 2-minute mark of the interview, and Max said very clearly, very matter-of-factly, we have to pull back from the UN. We have to pull out of the UN. We need our sovereignty back. And I was like, it was like a come to Jesus moment for me. It was like, I actually heard a politician that is more concerned about Canada than globalism. So immediately I'm in. I have to join this. This is, so I went, and of course I researched the platform too, and the platform had aligned with all of my values and ideas, and I joined. It's the first party I've joined since the Reform Party back in the day, and they inspired me to join because of Preston Manning and his ideas. But it was regional, and it didn't have a whole lot of hope of forming government ever. But whatever. So that was the last party I joined. So I joined the PPC and support Max, and only because the timing was perfect with what's happening in the world, with my level of understanding of my perspective on things. It was symbiosis. So fantastic. So I joined the PPC, help organize and do what I can to move it forward. And then all of a sudden the Yellow Vests start, and I'm looking at the issues. Of course, it's carbon tax, it's migrant pact, but that flows directly to the Sustainable Development Agenda and the UN, and ultimately Canadian sovereignty. And so the two are sort of like, you know, they're not connected, they're not aligned, of course, but the issues are the same. The problems that the party is going to have in attracting people is the same problem that the Yellow Vests are having to attract people. It's about waking Canada up. And I think both entities are doing that. And I think they're going to play a huge role in doing that, because I think the next election, based on what we've seen in Europe, based on what we've seen with Trump, is it's going to, and it has to go in the direction of less left and right and more nationalism versus globalism. And so if we can take that discussion to where it needs to go, and we can inform enough Canadians that, okay, first of all, nationalism isn't a bad thing, like we spoke earlier, and take that debate to nationalism versus globalism, I think we have an opportunity to attract a lot more Canadians, because it's way more important for us to have a country to fight about, and to fight. First of all, we have to fight for it. And once we fight for it and win, then we can come back together and we can fight about it, right? Together. And we can solve our issues that we have to solve in Canada. And then, okay, we can go left or right, socialism, capitalism, whatever the argument is. But I think right now, ultimately and intellectually, sure, it's still probably a battle of socialism versus capitalism, because ultimately this UN plan is a socialist idea. It's equality of the countries, equality of the globe, central government, big government telling everybody what to do. So, and they've actually stated on numerous occasions that the climate change issue isn't to deal with the climate. It's actually to change the economic state of the world from a capitalist to a socialist environment or system. And they've said it. So we know that. So I think if we can get and wake enough people to understand that this is a debate over nationalism and our sovereignty and our control and our country, then maybe we got a shot at saving this. There are other countries in Europe that we've seen that have done this and are doing this, and they're waking up. So thank God. Poland is a good example.
Hungary, Poland, I've heard. I know Italy. I think is it Greece that also just is looking at a right-wing party, or
I haven't heard. Well, there is that Golden Sunshine Party or whatever they're called, but I haven't heard lately. But yeah, there's definitely a movement for as a populist or nationalist movement. So that's encouraging. I think, of course, anything that happens in Europe, we seem to always be a little bit behind. But I mean, it's issue motivated. So once the issues start coming here, like we're starting to see, it'll snowball. But we really need to wake people up before it gets to the point where it's no return.
Yeah, fair enough. This is going back a little bit to, I think, more the sustainable development discussion we had. So just a question from the audience. Actually, it's from Dave, Space Dave, who is someone who helps me out a lot with my channel. I'm very grateful for Dave. Thank you, Dave, by the way. He's mentioning mineral rights, that Canadians don't own our mineral rights. So the mineral rights are owned by either government entities, referred to as the Crown, of course, or private individuals or corporations, referred to as freehold. Most owners of freehold mineral rights are not prepared to take the risk. What are your thoughts on that when it comes to this sustainable development? I mean, how much control do we actually have over our resources in general? And this might take us into the energy stuff as well. If you guys are still interested in keeping going, I was going to keep this in an hour, but everyone seems engaged, so I'll just keep going for now.
Yeah, sure. You know what? To be honest, I haven't really studied that aspect of this, but I mean, in the big picture, of course, I don't think right now that we have a lot of control, like myself as a citizen, or yourself, Kelly, or us as citizens of Canada, have any control of what's happening with our resources and our rights to those resources. I mean, that's a whole can of worms on itself, but still related, of course, to big money, big banks, multinationals owning the rights. I mean, we have Nestle that's somehow getting our water for nothing, right? And so, and people always say, and they ask me, and in discussion, it always seems to come up too, that, well, if it's socialism, then why are corporations keep pumping it? So from my vantage point, what I'm seeing is multinationals love this, because you're creating the UN. I mean, I hate always referring to Nazis, but I'm going to do it anyway. The Nazis did this. The Nazis controlled everything, but they allowed corporations to run as long as the government controlled the corporations, right? And controlled the direction that they went into. And so the corporations were allowed to get rich and prosper and do what they're doing as long as the government was telling them how to do business. Well, that's how what I see the UN doing. The UN is basically forcing the corporations to promote the narrative and to promote the agenda. I mean, and this is taking us a little off topic, but and again, it's funny because it's relative. It's just like Gillette here the other day. Okay?
Yes, Gillette. Be
right.
better. Be better.
Be better. Right. So toxic masculinity. So what do I do? The first thing I do after this gets raised, but I already knew this, but I had to go actually look and look at the actual paper on it. Toxic masculinity and the UN. So that's all I did is type into Google, and what comes up? There's a whole paper on gender and masculinity and toxic masculinity, and it's all laid out right there. And I'm looking at this. Well, there you go. And so now we have a multinational company that's pushing the narrative, right? So they're doing the work of the UN through the media, through advertising, through commercials. I mean, so the multinationals love it because their benefit, of course, is they're going to get paid off by the UN by whatever contracts they get or whatever resource they get allowed to exploit. And so and it's all part of the same scheme. I mean, we're inundated by media, we're inundated by mainstream media, news, Hollywood, multinational companies and their advertising schemes, virtue signaling, and this whole, but it's all pushing the same narrative. I mean, you look at for instance, 650 News in Saskatoon. So you talk to Gormley and you think you're actually in reality, you're actually, holy wow, the light's on and there's people home and things are actually looking pretty good. Then you listen to the news and it's exact opposite of what everybody's saying on Gormley, because they're pushing the same narrative. Now, if you listen to the news, especially international news on 650, and then listen to the news in Calgary, international news on their Calgary stations, or Vancouver or Winnipeg or Montreal, it's all the same narrative.
Yes. Yeah, it's all collaborated, right? It's not coincidental. There's something very specific. And I've noticed, you even get to the point where you can start to pick up on policy changes and upcoming policy changes, because suddenly, the CBC is talking an awful lot about handguns. Let me guess, we're going to try to ban handguns. And here we are, right? So,
yeah. So the multinationals include the media companies. And so here's the narrative. Here's what we're going to do with this issue, right? Here's the policy that we're going to come down with. So can you please start pumping the narrative and start indoctrinating everybody into how to think and how to react to it, and it'll work out just fine. And that's what happens, and that's what they do. So, but I don't know. What are you going to do?
Yeah, true enough. And I won't get into the energy sector stuff as much tonight. Sorry to interrupt. But because I'm going to be having on someone, actually, I'm going to have Jason LeBlanc on next week. He's one of the guys that stood up to Trudeau and asked a question about the energy sector in Regina. So we're going to chat next week a bit about that. But that's such a huge topic too, because of course, that's the interesting part too. We had, Trudeau buy this pipeline, and it's like, well, okay. And now what, right? And so you talk about, various ways of even just talking about corporations. I'm not an economist. I probably don't know what I'm talking about, but, people will argue then for, in defense of socialism. Well, it's actually, capitalism, and yeah, crony capitalism is bad. And there's lots of lobbying and there's lots of corruption and greed. I mean, anytime you have humanity, you have greed, right? But like you were saying, there's so much behind it. There's government regulation. Even if you look at, say, in Vancouver, there's a huge housing crisis on the coast because there's so many foreign people buying property that aren't necessarily living there, and the prices are going up. So people say, well, that's, maybe that's capitalism, that's bad. Well, no, it's happening because the regulations are loose and there's stuff going on between the government, provincially and nationally, and all this stuff we don't see. And it's all corrupt, right? Yeah, for sure. It's sick to me because I think people just don't do their research. And like you said, I see in the chat, someone said, who watches the news? Sadly, lots of people do. I wish that it weren't true, but the people that are most hidden from this are the people that aren't really, like you said, with your wife or someone else, they look at all this and they say, I'm overwhelmed, it's too much. I've heard that from a lot of friends, especially like more sensitive type people. A lot of women in particular don't even want to touch this stuff. But what's scary is that those same people are voting. Those same people are having an opinion, calling people racist and whatever. Well, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to get into it. well, then you probably don't have a right to say too much. And sadly, those are the people that are watching the news. So it's your average everyday folks that are on Facebook, or maybe just read one article on CBC in the morning. And I wish that they didn't, but they do. So all of us hanging out in the chat and watching conservative videos, we don't watch CBC. We don't take McLean seriously, but it's unfortunately a really strong narrative. If it wasn't, they wouldn't be around anymore. Or maybe they would, because they just got bailed out $595 million, but that's a different topic altogether.
Yep.
I wouldn't mind asking another quick question here, since we're getting to around 9 here. First, I'll open up the chat. If anybody other than MGTOW, MGTOW, who's causing some kerfuffles in there about a completely off-topic thing from a previous stream. So if you can just, shush for a couple seconds, and if anybody else wants to ask a question that is pertinent, please do. I think the only unpertinent question was, will I have another stream with Grace US? And the answer is yes, I will, probably in a week or so, possibly in a few days here on her channel, but that's the side note. My question to you, Mark, is with the yellow vest stuff, because you're way more involved than I am, and like you said, you're trying to kind of keep it going. How many movements are there? What's been happening? I know when it first started up, there was a huge issue with the owner, was it, or not the owner, the administrator, Tyler, was it? Like, what's going on with how many groups there are? Are they able to unite them? What's being shut down? What's being censored? Where's that all at right now?
So, yeah, when the movement started, I jumped aboard. And so, I mean, of course, everything I'm going to tell you is based on my personal experience and my perspective. But so when it started, we all jumped on, and somebody was lucky enough to start the first Facebook group, Yellow Vest. And that's the one that everyone flooded to initially. And it was Tyler Malenfant is his name. So, of course, it didn't take very long for the social media to do its job and do some vetting, and they found out some fairly damaging things with his history and of white supremacists or white nationalists and anti-Semitism and some baggage that could really hurt not only himself, but in my view, more importantly, hurt the movement. And so we tried to convince him, through a number of different ways. Listen, you should at the very least change your name, run a ghost profile and run it that way, so this baggage doesn't come back and bite you, but more importantly, bite us all in the ass and bring us all into disrepute, because the media is going to do it anyway, because as soon as you disagree or oppose the migrant pact, you're immediately a racist. So we thought, of course, it's important. We have to protect ourselves as much as we can, and our brand and the narrative, and try to keep control of the narrative. But he didn't buy into that, of course, because he saw, stars, and he was a big star, and he ran this group and blah, blah, blah. So then a bunch of us admins and different people got together in another group, and we started United Yellow Vest Canada. And then, but from that, we branched out and made it sort of a bunch of city groups and then provincial groups, and still under, sort of United Yellow Vest. But even within that group, it's for the long, and we're young, so we're going to have hiccups, we're going to have some kinks, but it's like herding cats. And so, for a couple of occasions, I got into it, and I really tried to convince people that we have to be issue-based protest. We can't be a solution-based protest. And so people disagreed, and that's fine. It's their prerogative. But ultimately, so we put together this group that is Canada-wide, and we have groups all over from every province and most major centers. There is still a faction that are solution-based in promoting the movement, and we're trying to ultimately, I don't want to get too specific into it because it's a pretty detailed story, but at the end of the day, we're trying to convince and make people understand that, listen, we love ideas. We think ideas are fantastic, and ultimately we're going to need those ideas. And if your idea is the one that everybody wants and everyone likes, like somebody mentioned referendum, and so great idea. It's always, been in politics or talked about in politics, but it's never really come through on a national level. So that may be a solution. Absolutely. I could probably get on board with something like that. And then there's some other ones, CPU and a whole bunch of solutions that came together. Then there was a bunch of manifestos, declarations and proclamations, and it was just from all sides, from everywhere. And I'm looking around like, okay, you know what? I'm going to back away from all of this shit, and I'm going to just focus on United Vest Canada, Yellow Vest Canada, and we're just going to keep trucking along. And then another opportunity came where we all came together, as I was mentioning earlier, and now we have this United Yellow Vest Canada that's spread across Canada. We have Yellow Vest Rebellion. They got 22,000 members. We have the Convoy to Ottawa that's joined us, and so that's huge. And so,
yeah, is sorry to interrupt. Is the convoy separate? I know there's been a lot of oil and gas protests, or is the convoy united? And I'll throw another question in from, we have Stampy Bear asks, is there a way to get involved with the Yellow Vest protest if you're not a Facebook user? Are there any other mediums to connect?
Yeah, well, Facebook is probably the best way, but there is a website. There's a couple of different websites. Well, there's probably 5 that I'm aware of. So, and it's a good question, because people at my rallies, even communicating what's happening with the rallies is tough if people aren't on Facebook, or even Twitter doesn't have a lot of activity with Yellow Vests. So, you know what? That's hard. That's a question I can't really answer. I'm trying to look at it from my perspective, and I don't know how I would do that, other than Google Yellow Vest and find the website, and you'll find something that'll lead you in the right direction. But social media wise, it's pretty much Facebook based. So anyway, so we have this group that's administering all of these pages and from provinces and cities, and it's coming together. And so we're trying to get these other groups that are solution based to join us, not to stifle their idea, not to say, no, we don't want solutions. Of course we want solutions. We want ideas. We want people to talk about ideas, and that's, but we need that critical mass to attract most Canadians based on the issues. Once we get there, then we can talk about solution. So then, of course, Glenn Carrot, he's the guy that's heading up the Convoy organization, which is an interesting discussion too, because it started, Yellow Vest Convoy to Ottawa was started around the same time that Canada Action and Rally for Resources were promoting a convoy to Ottawa. So there was 3 different entities involved in two convoys that were being planned initially. And then, make the long story short, Canada Action and Rally for Resources, on a couple of different occasions in the media, were shit-talking the Yellow Vests and jumping on the bandwagon of the media. And the same thing that they're doing, and promoting us as racist and bigoted and anti-immigrant and all of these things, which of course we're not. And we have a mission statement that's very clear that we're not against immigration. We're just against the fact that we have an unelected body dictating to us what we're going to do for immigration or migration. So
precisely, yeah, that we don't have as much say over our own issues, right?
We can very easily determine our policies in Canada as far as immigration. Just because they're coming from somewhere else doesn't mean we have to give up our power to decide who's coming and how many of them, right? So that was the stated problem by Canada Action and Rally for Resources. But it goes a little deeper than that, and this is where, politics again comes into play. And so Rally for Resources, Canada Action, on both of their boards are filled with Conservative Party members. Okay, so they're heavily supported by the Conservative Party nationally and provincially in Alberta. So that creates another level of politics that none of us want to be part of this, because we're doing this because we want to represent Canadians and take our sovereignty back, get the oil business back, and the energy sector back to business, people back to work. So, I mean, but the politics always has to find its way in. So it does. So anyways, to make a long story short, so they basically have now backed off of their convoys. They're not going to go ahead with their convoys. Yellow Vest is still full steam ahead and going, which is cool, because now all of the people that were involved in Canada Action and Rally for Resources, just regular folks that aren't part of a lobby group or a political party, that just wanted to join this convoy and this protest, are now coming over and signing up as well to the Yellow Vest. So Yellow Vest Convoy and Glenn's team have raised 130,000 last time I checked.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic.
And that's just to help support, fuel. There is a company that's donating fuel for the convoy, but we're stopping leaving Red Deer on the 14th, stopping in Regina the night of the 14th. So of course there's going to be accommodation issues, there's going to be food issues, and we're looking at, at the very minimum, 1,000 trucks coming from Alberta. We don't know how many from BC. We don't know how many from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all along the way are going to join us. So, when you have to support that many people, it's going to take some resources financially as well. So that's the GoFundMe page that they have set up. They have two, and so they're working out quite well. So from Regina we carry on to Dryden, Ontario, on the night of the 15th, and then the night of the 16th will be in Sault Ste. Marie, and then the night of the 17th will be in Arnprior, Ontario, which is just outside of Ottawa. And then the 18th is sort of a contingency day, depending on how long the convoy takes, depending on weather and whatever else can happen.
Always good to plan for weather in Canada.
Yeah, well, exactly. So, and then show up on Potato's doorstep on the 19th and
brilliant.
Pick a fight.
That sounds fantastic. Now, kind of speaking of that, now pick a fight just being a lingo thing, but I am curious because, of course, France has gotten pretty intense. Do you think, I know neither of us promote violence, but do you think that realistically all this stuff is going to lead to more riots in the sense of actual, chaos? Where do you think this is all headed? Or do you think we can manage to push this through? Or how much of that, I guess, is going to depend on whether Trudeau gets in again, right? Potato. I shouldn't say his name either. I apologize, guys.
That's all good. Yeah, I haven't seen any violence locally. Of course, in Saskatoon, there's been zero. I know there has been a couple of dust ups, one in Edmonton, and then the first one in Ottawa. But one of the things that I've seen, I think we touched on it earlier, is when we first started in this yellow vest. Initially, there seemed to be a lot of the professional protester type involved and hitching their wagon to what we were doing. And so I think that caused some problems. And then, of course, you always have Antifa showing up to these things, and especially the bigger ones. And so, of course, we don't promote violence, and that's right in our mission statement, and our whole entity is no racism in our Facebook groups, and no promoting of violence, and peaceful protest and creative protest like the convoy. So no, does that mean there won't be violence? I can't guarantee that. Nobody can, right? Because who shows up is going to dictate whether there's violence. And if they want to, people have to defend themselves. They can't just lie around and take it. So if groups like Antifa come to cause trouble, well, I'm sure there'll be trouble. But no, we don't want that. And another thing is we don't actively promote any political groups. We don't promote any race-based groups, of course, because we don't want any part of that. There have been some groups that have tried to hitch their wagon to the movement. There's a political party in Alberta, National Citizens Alliance, I think they're called, or something.
Is that Harvey?
Garvey. Yeah. So he's hitched his wagon, and so you watch videos of what's supposed to be a yellow vest rally in Edmonton. There's a couple of different rallies. One is yellow vest, and then there's this one that was promoted as yellow vest. But then there's Steve Garvey, or whatever his name is, with all of his party paraphernalia and you name it. And it's like, dude, you just hijacked our movement. So that has been an issue a little bit, and on Facebook as well. If professional protesters and political entities trying to hitch their wagon to things, but I think it's gotten to the point now where it is big enough, and we are going in the right direction, and there is enough good people that are running things on these Facebook groups that are getting control of that, and so I got a shout out to Gormley here in town. He's been really quite charitable to the Yellow Vest movement and quite fair.
There's not many people being fair right now, so it's good to hear that. Gormley, lots of people have varying opinions on him, but at least he's giving it an honest go. It doesn't seem like everyone else is just trying to find the one person causing a bit of trouble and just label the entire movement of hundreds of thousands of people as, essentially we're apparently all in, whatever it is, soldiers of Odin or whatever the the scary group of the day is to them, that's what they're gonna, you know, drive home, right? So
yeah, exactly. It's the narrative, and there's a reason they push that particular narrative. I mean, if we were a yellow vest movement for refugees, well, you know, there wouldn't be any labeling. The media would be pushing us like we're, you know, the next best thing since sliced bread. So, I mean, it is, you know, it's like you say, as soon as you say we oppose the migrant pact, well, you're automatically racist. The media will do whatever they need to do to continue that narrative and make our job that much harder. So I appreciate guys like Gormley who give us a fair shake and just, you know, let us actually talk and give us an outlet so we can denounce racism and denounce violence and these types of things that the media wants to label us with.
yeah, fair enough. And I mean, I've read in the chat, people are saying, you know, who cares about the labels? You do what you got to do. And that's all true, right? You know, we have to all stand up and be brave. It doesn't matter what we get called. But that being said, it's always good to recognize like the overall atmosphere, the environment, the climate, right? I mean, that's what I always say is sometimes, to me, we all have a different role, right? My role is not to be Little Miss Warrior fighting with everybody. I'm a gentle being. That's who I am. So I'm probably going to be appealing more to, you know, I've been talking to NDPers about this stuff and liberals and people that don't vote. I'm probably more likely to convert people from that side than I am to be the one that's out in the front lines, right? But some people are more aggressive, and I guess it's whatever your tact is. Some people do comedy, you know, whatever. I feel like everybody needs to step up and offer something at this point. If you care about this country, we all have to do something, whether it's just making a video, right?
And so it's interesting because, I mean, me personally, I've been called, you name it, from conspiracy theorist to racist to bigot to Islamophobe to xenophobe. I'm married to an immigrant, but still, it doesn't matter. I say something that somebody disagrees with, I'm a xenophobe. But so I mean, me personally, I really don't give a shit what people call me or what they say or whatever, because I know what I believe in, and I know what racism is, and I know what those words mean, and I'm none of them. So I don't care what they say and what they label with me. But here's the kicker: is being in a sort of a leadership role, or you know, an organizational role with the yellow vests, and putting my mug out there, representing all of the yellow vests in Canada. When I'm speaking to these different media outlets, I have a responsibility to protect the integrity of the movement and to protect what we're doing. So I mean, of course, I'm going to denounce racism because it's not about racism. It has nothing. We are not a racist group. But I also have to be concerned to how the pages are being managed, and the people I'm working with have to be concerned about the groups, because, you know, there are people that say horrible things and believe in things that will tarnish the movement, but there's also Antifa people and people of that ilk that come into these groups and they start chatting and they say things just so they can screenshot, you know, something that was said that's racist in this group, and then they run back with the picture and they give it to the media and they give it to, you know,
yeah,
Facebook,
outrage gotcha culture. Yeah.
right. And all of a sudden we're racist, when all our mods are doing a fantastic job of weeding all of the crap, and we just can't control everything. And so we do have a responsibility to protect the integrity of the movement and our message. So you know, at some point you have to say, no, you can't say these things because it's going to hurt what ultimately we're trying to do. So that doesn't mean you don't have free speech, but you also have responsibility in that speech. And if you don't do your part and act responsible and give something and power to our enemies, then we have to take control and get that shit off, right? So it's a fine line to walk, because I get it. And even, you know, as within the yellow vest movement, the issue of Islam and what do we allow for posts and what do we don't allow for posts. And I mean, it's very easy to make an argument that, yes, of course, we have to talk about Islam as it relates to the migrant pact, because most of the migrants are coming from the Middle East and Islamic countries, where they bring their religion and they bring their practices and cultural practices that doesn't fit with Western civilization, which in itself is okay on a small scale that can be easily swallowed up by our culture, and the integration will work just fine. But when they come en masse, then they ghettoize, and then all of a sudden they they keep their culture and their religion, which is also a political and a lawful aspect to their lives. So, I mean, do we talk about it on Yellow Vest? Well, yes. And I've said, running the groups that, and our admins have agreed that, yeah, we have to allow this discussion to happen, but then you have to be careful and not direct these discussions or this frustration and anger to individual Muslims, right? Because
yes, exactly, because
we can't judge Muslims by necessarily their religion, because we have reformist Muslims, we have ex-Muslims, we have Muslims that believe but they don't impose. So there's all this nuance that has to enter into the equation, and especially with Islam. Somebody asked me the other day, what are your thoughts on Islam? And I had my politics hat on at the time, and I said, I can't, unless you have 2 hours, I can't tell you, because if I tell you that I am critical of Islam, you're going to call me a racist. And so that's a soundbite that I don't want to have. If you're going to ask me that topic, then we got to sit down for at least an hour so I can tell you that I put the issue of Islam into 4 categories. I say there's the issue of Muslims and Muslim immigration, and Muslim as my neighbor, as my business partner, as my customer and friend. So all those things under Muslims. Then you have Islam, the religion. Well, I could spend 2 hours talking about Islam and its impact on Canadian culture and Western civilization, and how it doesn't fit into what we're doing here. And then you go from there to Islamists. So Islamists are another whole thing, and I think out of the whole issue of Islam, that's the most dangerous element, even over terrorism, because Islamism is not necessarily a violent ideology or a violent agenda, but it is a political agenda, and it can really, as we've seen in other places, get its tentacles into our system, and then using the Quran to develop the laws, which is completely opposite to what we do in a free and liberated country like Canada. And then of course you have the terrorists. So but that discussion of those 4 things or issues regarding Islam, I mean, that's a 2-hour discussion at least. So how do I say that to somebody in a Yellow Vest group? Well, no, you can't say this, or yes, you can say this, because either way, whether if I don't post it, it's going to create drama. If I do let it be posted, it's going to create drama. And then the discussion always is on the comments, and I'm looking at this discussion, and there's so many people that just don't understand on both sides of the argument. It just turns into this whole name calling, and sometimes it goes into actual racist comments, and it's
a messy one. It's a messy one. Yeah, it's so true, because even I get told, well, you're being too nice about it. And then there's the people say, well, you're a racist. And I found it funny. Julie made a comment, Julie Moore is in the chat, and she said earlier just that she was called a Jew and a Nazi in the same day kind of thing. And I've been called a Zionist shill and a neo-Nazi in the same day myself. And so it's kind of this idea where you can be called, a lightweight and a racist all at once. And so, what am I then, right? Like, where do I fit in this? Well, I'm just trying to not cause violence, for God's sake.
And that's where that's where at the end of the day, I don't care. You guys can call me whatever you want to call me. Yeah. I understand. And I had to, because, and we can do another show on Islam too at some point, Kelly, if you ever want to. But at the end of the day, I got into this whole issue of Islam because I always consider myself not to be racist. I'm not racist. Why am I made to feel like I am? Because I'm concerned about a religion and its ideas and what it's motivating and what it's causing and creating. So when I criticize that, why am I made to feel like I'm racist? Like this is there's something wrong.
Well, it's insanity. So, and wasn't Islamophobia brought up? Was it not a term that was invented by jihadists, apparently?
Yeah. Yeah, it was Muslim Brotherhood actually developed the word, or started the word Islamophobia.
Imagine that. Hey, yeah, we wouldn't want to criticize them. They're just such lovely beings.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, God, that's a huge topic. I'd love to actually have you on again to talk more about that at some point, if you don't mind. For tonight, I'm going to wrap it up with a couple questions, if you don't mind. Sure. Just because it's about 9:25. That did go fast. You were right, Mark. It doesn't take long.
It's amazing how it just flies by.
So true. So the question I've heard from, I don't know if it's two different people or just someone that asked twice. Are both of us, either of us individually, pro getting out of the UN altogether? And that's a very interesting question. I know both of us, of course, are PPC supporters. I know Max is talking about the UN just being an overall corrupt institution and maybe we should just kind of ditch it, he's implied. I don't know enough to really say yes or no, but honestly, my gut would say yes. My gut would say that I don't think at this point in time that they are doing a lot of benefit to this country. I think that they lied to the world for so long about being this supposed wonderful unifying world peace, you know, let's all just shake hands, kumbaya, blah, blah, blah. That's sort of what they come off as or supposedly come off as. I don't think that there's really much of a use for them. I think if we can't even figure out the government in our country, so we have enough, like we are almost separating West and East at this point because things are so negative, because Ottawa can't handle the demographics of, say, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan because they don't know what the hell's happening here. There's already that discord and dissonance. How do you run a country in any capacity from like a world parliament, right? So that's my thoughts on it. I don't think it's all that useful. I think ultimately if people wanted to work together as nations, they could come up with a better system. What are your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, so I always sort of default back to Jordan Peterson's response to the similar question, and he compared it to when the banks and the crisis in 2008 when the markets crashed the last time, and the narrative at the time that the banks are too big to fail, right? Well, Jordan Peterson sort of spun that onto the UN and actually said the UN will fail because it's too big. And it's a behemoth. It's a bureaucracy that just of unimaginable proportion. And so the problem is all 193 countries, other than the Vatican and Palestine, which aren't really countries, so they say 193 plus 2, and North Korea is another one. So suffice it to say that 99% of the countries on the planet are part of the UN. So after the next election, whoever gets in walks up to the UN and says, I'm tearing up my membership card and I'm walking out. Well, that's not going to happen, right? Do I personally think we should be out of the UN? Yes, absolutely. I think it's completely ridiculous. I mean, we're talking about an entity that is controlled by people that put Saudi Arabia to head the Human Rights Commission, right? Like,
yeah, it would be funny if it wasn't so bloody sick, right?
Right, exactly. Like, yeah. It's so ridiculous, and so, but all you have to do is look at all the members on the Human Rights Council, and it gets more ridiculous. And it would be funny, and we should make jokes about it, but at the end of the day, we're supporting despots, we're supporting genocide, we're supporting all of the things that the United Nations were supposed to be protecting in their organization.
Everything they claim to be about, ironically, is
exactly
the opposite
of what they do, which sounds very similar to the Democratic Party, but whatever.
That's a whole other story, but so true.
But so, yeah, so I think we should leave the UN? Yes, but do I think we can? I don't think it's reasonable to suggest that, yeah, we can pull out of the UN, tomorrow. But I think it's a direction that Trump is pushing things in. Trump is amazing for shutting down the UN, and his ambassador Haley was fantastic at denouncing the UN and their agendas.
Did you happen to hear his speech, the UN speech that he gave? That was just incredible.
Yeah, it's one of the best speeches I've ever heard. Now, of course, it's what I wanted to hear, so of course I'm going to say it's one of the best. But it was so true, and it's so. And I mean, Trump is another hour discussion, but I mean, Trump represents this nationalism versus globalism fight. And why do you think that the Democrats want to destroy Trump at the same time establishment Republicans want to destroy Trump? Because they're all part of the same establishment that is bought and paid for by the UN and push the agenda of the UN and big banks and multinationals who have all bought their politicians in America, especially. So, of course, when Trump rolls in and defeats those 16 Republicans and gets the nomination and then defeats Hillary, it's been a shitstorm ever since. And it will continue to be one because the globalists are fighting back. They have it in their language right now. I read it today that they have to focus on the attack on their agenda, because they see it. Well, of course they see it because Trump and then Poland and Austria and Hungary and all these countries their politicians are getting elected, and they're waking up and saying, you know what, we don't want this anymore. This is too much. You guys have too much control. But they're actually, and they've written it down, that we're going to fight back against that narrative. Well, how can you fight back any more than you've already done? They own the media. They own Hollywood. They own the multinationals. They own our politicians. I mean, Trump is such a huge part of this puzzle, and without him, we would be in just a terrible state. So I'm hoping that, you know, whatever, the rest of us can wake up and pull out of at least. So this is why I like Maxine Bernier and like the People's Party, especially with this issue, because Max has stated openly, we're going to pull back from the Sustainable Development Agenda. We're going to pull back from the Paris Accord. In fact, we're going to scrap it altogether, the agreement. We're going to scrap the Migrant Pact. We're going to make decisions for Canada that are best for Canadians and our country. And so that's what, you know, will Max walk up to the UN and tear his UN card up? Well, no, he can't, because we'd be the only country on the planet that isn't part of it other than North Korea. So, I mean, it's not reasonable to think that, but I think it's definitely where we need to go, and we need to push and scrap these agenda items, and maybe at some point the UN will disband, at least maybe not recognizable to what it is now, and maybe something different, or maybe Western. How about a Western country alliance? How about Western civilization aligning for our best interest? You know, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, the 56 plus 1 countries, because we add Palestine to it, those countries right there, the motto is to look after all Muslims throughout the world. So that is their agenda. That is what they are, a group of UN countries. That's their sole purpose, is to look after their fellow Muslims. Great. So why can't we have a group of Western civilized countries and say we're all part of this for the benefit of Western civilization? And if we did that, the media would go absolutely insane because we're racist, right? And it's just the white man trying to conquer the world again. It's just, so, I mean, it's
you end up in a rock between a hard place. And honestly, it's sad because, like, and I'll be honest, I'm excited as a PPC member. I was excited at the EDA lunch to see, it's always good to see, you know, other women there, because the narrative is that Maxime is, you know, sexist, whatever, everything, you know, gender issues up the wazoo, apparently, because he doesn't call himself a feminist. Like, thank God he doesn't. I couldn't hear another person bring up the word gender right now this year. I don't think I can even. I think I'm already saturated in January with the word gender. But I don't know. I don't want to get too much into the PPC stuff, but I do have to say it's always nice to see, whether it's just people doing yellow vest or anybody involved in a party that's kind of pushing against this. It's nice to see people that are immigrants, people that aren't white Europeans, because ultimately it will be their voices that I think might help to really push this, right? I speak a lot with One Godless Woman, because you know, a Saudi Muslim apostate voice is more powerful than mine. People can take her more seriously. So you don't want to use intersectionality, but at the same time, it is helpful to have a voice. You know, I know there was at the lunch there was a gal from Syria. She's a lawyer and a legal Syrian not refugee, a legal Syrian immigrant. And she mentioned that she had just come back from Syria. A lot of people could be going back there. She doesn't know what's going on. She's very frustrated with the way that our border situation is. She doesn't like the UN being in charge. So it's not just white people that are worried about this. This is, like you said, it's not a race thing. This is a Canada thing. And ultimately, we're just worried Canadians, right? And so it does get to be awfully frustrating. But I hope that more and more people can step up and see. I think I posted that video at the first Yellow Vest protest of that First Nations man who was deaf mute, and he was just clapping his mitts, you know, so cold he can't wear hands, and you know, and he was just trying to get his voice out there. And I mean, this affects all of us, right? This is every single person, and maybe this will be the thing that unites First Nations and you know, the settlers, as they call us. I don't know what you want to use as a word, but there's a lot of division here already. And I'm wondering if, you know, is it one of those things where the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Do we end up coming together because we realize what's facing this country? I don't know.
Well, I think, yeah, I think we do come together. My enemy is my friend. Only because we have a larger enemy, so let's band together. I agree that there has to be that, but it's funny because, I mean, if what I'm saying is righteous, and if I was behind a curtain or whatever, and nobody could understand or realize or identify what color I am. Let's just say I had I had a message, and it was righteous, and it was something that most people could agree. Well, if you take that curtain away and you put my white face on the camera, I lose half of the people that are watching simply because of the color of my skin. Doesn't whatever I'm saying is righteous and it's factual and it's right, but we've come to the point where it doesn't matter. So you're saying it's nice to have some other faces and some other races of people joining us in the same fight as insulation, and it's true, and it's sad because I've never looked at an individual based on the color of their skin before. I judge a person by who they are and what they tell me and how they act around me. So now, because of what we've developed here in this hypersensitive racist environment, now I, who've never judged people or looked at people in the color of their skin before, now I have to look at this gentleman who's of Middle Eastern descent and he's brown, and he's saying the same thing that I'm saying, and we agree. And so, but I have to actually let him speak in front of me so we can get the message out, and nobody's going to have that message stopped because they're racist, right? So it's so frustrating when I would just love to be together with, I don't care what color skin are, a bunch of Canadians, come together and let's tackle these issues rationally, with fact, with debate, and let's see if we can tackle this together. I don't care what color skin you are. I don't care where you come from. I don't care anything. I just, you're a Canadian. You value Canadian culture, our values, our laws, and you love freedom, and you love democracy, and you love respect, and you love equality, and all of these things. Fantastic. Let's move in the same direction. Right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess we'll probably wrap it up here. We've been going for about an hour and a half. So any last words you want to say? I feel like what you just said is a really nice way to end it off, but I wouldn't mind giving you the opportunity, whether you want to plug your Twitter account, whether you want to plug your channel. I have thrown your channel into the chat. I don't know how many videos you do. You do kind of the odd one, but please feel free to finish this off with whatever you feel you most want to get out there at the end of this message. So
yeah, you know, I really don't have much more to say. Holy smokes, I've been talking steady here for over an hour and a half. So
it happens.
I don't know if you want me to add any more, because it might turn into another 20 minutes.
The whole add a 30-second bit and it goes to 10 minutes. I've done that. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's just it. So yeah, no, I don't need to plug anything. I'm, you know, I mean, you got my YouTube page up there, I guess. And we'll see you around. And I mean, I'm prolific with live videos on Facebook, especially now with Yellow Vests, and I'll be doing it more with the PPC. And so I got wearing two hats right now, at least. Well, plus I own my own business, so I wear that hat too. And so, yeah, it's all good. I've said everything I need to say. I really appreciate you having me on this show, and it's awesome. I love long form discussion where we can actually get to the meat of some issues and you know, get some information out there. So it's good.
Yeah, ditto. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, sorry guys, it went a little bit long. I try to usually wrap it up around an hour, but we were kind of just getting to some of the meat, and this is a big topic. So I mean, I wanted to do a 2-part series. Maybe it's going to be 3, maybe it'll be 4. There's so many issues around the UN that I don't know. We could probably talk about this for an extended period of time, but I do appreciate everyone's attention. I threw again Mark's link for YouTube in the description, or in the chat rather. His Twitter handle is, I think, Grizzly Patriot. I can't remember the handle at Mark_Friesen, yeah, but if you say Grizzly Patriot, you'll find him.
At Mark Friesen 08, I think. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And I'm on Twitter as well. kellyraeanne is my handle. If you feel like following me, I do the odd thing there. Yeah, that's about it. If I missed any questions, I do apologize. Feel free to throw them in the comments section when this is uploaded. And from there, we'll pretty much leave it at that. Please do your part in whatever way you can for this country. If you can, any gift that you have, try to use it. We all have a voice. We all have a role to play. And it's a great country. It's worth fighting for. So thank you for being here, Mark. Much appreciated. Hope you guys all have a great weekend. As always, be good to each other, but not because the government tells you to. Ciao.